So my background, I started life as an Air Force operator. My last job was doing space situational awareness, so tracking satellites and space debris in Cheyenne Mountain, including some of the anti-satellite tests. So I've got that sort of perspective coming to this problem. For the last 10 years, I've been working for an NGO, working on space sustainability and space cooperation and space policy. So I think in broad strokes, I'm sort of where Josh is, and that I think Brian has touched on a very important issue, which is how do we deal with this problem, which we've dealt with in other domains, but is relatively new for the space domain. And so I think the theme of my remarks would be, I would summarize it as space is normalizing. What I mean by that is it's becoming more like the air, land, and sea domains. We're seeing a rapid increase in commercial activity to the point where something that was originally dominated by governments in the near future is probably going to be dominated by commercial activity. So think of the airspace where 90% of the air traffic is commercial, and then you have a little bit of military and government stuff going on the side. That's, I think, where space is headed. We're seeing it globalize, and that space started as the activities of two countries, US and Soviet Union. Now there's more than 60 countries that have more than one satellite, and that number is growing every year. So there's more countries doing more different things. Some of them are interested in space for economic benefits and commercial. Some are interested for prestige. Some are interested for national security. Some are interested for economic, like socioeconomic benefits. Some are interested in all the above. So it's a whole diverse range of things going on. And space is becoming more integrated into every level of our national security. So space started out as being mainly used for strategic purposes, intelligence, verification treaties, warning a nuclear attack, nuclear command and control. Now there's hardly a military operation the US conducts that does not use space at some level. OIF, OEF, all the current activities in counterterrorism, all of that utilizes space to a very high degree, both from intelligence, prepare for the battlefield, guidance, navigation, BDA, all of those are space enabled. And future conflicts the same way. So this aspect of space becoming part of future conflicts, I think, is inevitable. The question is how much of that conflict on Earth is going to extend into and deal with space. And that's sort of what Brian is touching about. So part of this normalization is all these other domains have figured out ways to manage the conflict piece. And by that, I mean they've said, well, this particular capability, this particular weapons technology, this particular activity is deemed too dangerous or cannot be controlled, like, for example, chemical, biological weapons. So they're put off limits. That's where the arms control piece comes in. They've also figured out, well, we need to have sort of norms of behavior for how we behave such that we can help distinguish between the responsible behavior and the irresponsible behavior, which then helps detect what potential threats could be. We haven't really figured that out in the space world yet. And then the next step would be having military-to-military discussions on how we do military-to-military interactions in space that will mitigate some of the tensions, and then also feed into the self-defense part that Brian talked about. So in addition to the Law of the Sea Convention, which I think it's very important to point out that we helped create it, yet we have not ratified it. That's a whole different political discussion. There's something else called the Incidents at Sea Agreement. This is an agreement between the US and Soviet Union that talks about how our military ships and aircraft interact with each other. And this came about as a result of some very high profile incidents in the early stages of the Cold War, where you had ships passing very close to each other, potentially ramming each other, that were concerns for both sides because there was fears that they would spark a crisis which then could lead to nuclear war. When the intent really wasn't that. The intent was just kind of jockeying or collecting intelligence, whatever. So we had an agreement with the Soviets on how to do those activities, ships tailing other ships, doing intelligence collection, that sort of relieve some of the tensions. We don't have anything like that in space. And that's sort of what Brian is getting at in terms of talking to the other governments, the other militaries, and figuring out, okay, we're all doing close approaches, we're all doing co-orbital activities. How do we create a framework to do them for the intelligence purposes, for the commercial purposes, people's purposes, in a way that we can distinguish those for potential hostile activities? And then I would say the final step is to talk about how the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, applies to space conflicts in space, just like it does other conflicts. So if you go over to the CAOC over in the Middle East, and this is the Air Operations Center where they plan all the air operations activities against ISIS and the other operations in the region. They have lawyers whose job is to screen all of the potential air missions to check for basically legal questions. All right, you said you're going to go ahead and bomb this facility. Well, what's it located next to? Is there a school next to it? Right? Is there something located a couple levels above the target you want to hit? What kind of a weapon are you going to use? How are you going to manage the side effects? Because one of the principles of international humanitarian law is to minimize the impact on civilians and those that are non-combatants, and proportionality, all kinds of other stuff. We haven't really, as far as I can tell, figured out what all that means for space yet. If there's a satellite that is providing, let's say, military communications, but is also providing, let's say, search and rescue services, if I go ahead and if I take that satellite out, is there going to be what's the effect, the other effect aside from the military effect? What are my range of options for taking out that satellite? Cyber attack, jamming attack, kinetic attack. Which ones are applicable under certain conditions? What are the rule sets for how you employ different types of military capabilities? What is the threshold for imminent attack, or imminence that then sets the threshold for your self-defense rights under the UN Charter? But I can't think of probably a more charged geopolitical issue than that one right there. Is what is imminence and what is self-defense? But we're going to have to get there at some point. These are all questions we have grappled with in other domains, but as of yet, we really haven't had a chance to, or haven't really had to grapple with them in the space domain. And this is something that not only the US has to figure out, but our allies, because increasingly you've seen over the last two administrations more discussion about if there is going to be a conflict in space, it's going to involve our allies, because we're using their satellites, we're partnering with them on the ground. So not only is what is our perception and what is our take on these issues of self-defense and how we deal with this issue, but what is our allies' perception of them? And how does that impact how we respond? And again, this is not new. Again, we do this in other domains. We do air planning, we do maritime planning and land planning. And then, we also have to talk to our potential adversaries. There's that classic line from Dr. Strangelove, if those old of us remember what that is. They say, well, you had this doomsday weapon. We would have behaved differently if we knew about it. Like, well, we were going to announce it next Thursday, but we didn't get a chance to do it. That sort of touches on something that I think both Brian and Josh hinted at, is that historically the US has been extremely secretive about space stuff, even more so than anything else that we do, even more so than cyber, which tends to be a very secretive domain. That creates many challenges for how we talk about this, for how we interact with our allies, and of course how we interact with our adversaries. And so as part of the normalization, we're going to have to figure out how we normalize space, and how do we lower some of the classification barriers to be able to talk about it more, to have some impacts. Because not only is this a policy decision that impacts the military, but impacts everybody else too. We use space every day, whether it's GPS or weather, satellite radio, satellite TV, take your pick. There are potential impacts to society as a whole if there's going to be a conflict in space. And that, my opinion, as someone who works for NGO, talks about kind of public engagement, there I think needs to be at least more engagement with the public and public discussion of some of these policy options and strategies and what the implications are, because they may be affected by things. So I'll close this by saying, along the lines of all this, we recently put out a report on global counterspace capabilities. We did a open source assessment of what multiple countries are doing on the kind of co-orbital anti-satellite technologies that we're talking about tonight, but also direct descent anti-satellite technologies, jamming, cyber capabilities. Our intent was to say, what can we figure out based on all the open source stuff to put it in one place, so then we can talk about that and as a way to talk about potential policies and strategies. The executive summary for that was included in the pack of materials. The report is available for free on our website if you want to go read 150 pages of fairly technical details on things. CSIS also put out a very similar report. We ended up collaborating with them at the very end. Theirs is a more high-level view. Ours is a more detailed assessment of some of what actually happened, including details of some of the rendezvous and prox ops that Brian talked about that have been conducted by the US, Russia, and China over the last 10 years that sort of are the technologies and capabilities that are creating some of this concern. So I'll finish there and welcome your questions when we get to the discussion part.